Dan Attrell, thank you so much for coming back on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me, Alex. The pleasure is all mine, as always.
Can you share with the listeners, Dan, a little bit about who is this figure, Petrus Alfonsi? And when we talk about things like Talmudic esotericism or the Latin polemical tradition, what would you like our listeners to know as we kind of go through the historical tributaries and influences?
So maybe where we can start is thinking about what esotericism is. There are a number of competing theories as to how it can be defined or circumscribed, but I think two really dominant theories are: one, esotericism is a mode of discourse. It's a way of speaking which occludes. It always makes reference to the hidden, to the inner circle, and by necessity it sort of others and excludes the masses. And so that's really one way of thinking about esotericism is as a way of speaking or writing. And then another way of thinking about it is that it is the sum of, let's say, hidden subjects that are circumscribed by apologetics and polemics. And so what we're going to talk about today is the Latin polemical tradition. And what that was philosophers, essentially, and theologians sitting around in their letter rooms and writing out debates, writing out polemics against philosophical or theological opponents. And what we'll find is that in the process of doing this throughout centuries, that is really where a tremendous amount of information about esotericism came to light. That is, there were thinkers within the Catholic Church. Surely this phenomenon exists elsewhere, but for our own purposes today, we're going to focus on the Latin West. And they would read works of Islamic or Jewish or pagan literature, and they would make an account of what they agreed with and what they didn't agree with. And what you would find is that they would often come to disagreements over very, very minor points, over really nitty-gritty minutia. Sometimes it involved grammar or the shape of a letter even. Other times it was debates as to the nature of the cosmos, what fueled magic. Was it demons or were these natural forces? And these are all kind of debates that were fleshed out within the church. And what I call that is the Latin polemical tradition. And what we're going to talk about today is specifically the role of the Mendicant orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans chiefly. So not the cloistered monastic monks, but more so the wandering preaching monks who either preached to heretics like the Dominicans did, or preached to the urban poor like the Franciscans did. And these two groups, because they were so involved in preaching and in debating, they got really involved in these very esoteric debates over occult minutiae. So, like we were saying, Talmudic esotericism. You have things like the Shir Kumah, the measuring of the body of God, which is a practice within rabbinic Judaism or an idea. And, for example, the Mendicants, and really this tradition started with Petrus Alfonsi, who we'll get into in a second, they thought that this was ridiculous. Like, they were like, God is a fully transcendent being. How are you supposed to be measuring his body? Clearly, you are silly and irrational. So they would battle Jews on the level of how rational they were. And they did the same with Muslims a little bit later because they were less known in those circles. But Petrus Alfonsi marks the beginning of a trend. Well, let's say two trends. The first trend is Jews converting from Judaism to Christianity and then writing works, polemical works, that then refute their former co-religionists. So these usually would be refutations of very minor points. So before, you would just say, oh, they're mistaken, they're heretics, or they hate Jesus, or whatever, and you can easily dismiss the Jews. But what Petrus Alfonsi tried to do was to dismiss them on terms that were scientific in his day. They were in accordance with reason. And so he was really going and systematically picking apart his opponents. And now this took the form of a dialogue called the Adversus Judaios, or the dialogue against the Jews. There's a lot of ways that these anti-Jewish works, this tradition, manifests. Sometimes it's in Judaios, Adversus Judaios, or Contra Judaios. They all mean the same thing. And what these works usually are is works written by Jews attempting to dismantle Jewish ideas and Jewish philosophy on its own terms. So, the Church Fathers had also written anti-Jewish works. The New Testament itself has plenty of passages that demonstrate how Christianity is more spiritual and Judaism is more carnal. That's a trope that will be repeated again and again. And the Church Fathers basically just ran with that, and they didn't try to attack or dismantle Judaism on Judaism's own terms. They did it on their terms because they were busy basically solidifying their own identities, which were still somewhat nebulous at the time. But by the 12th century, the tables had really turned, and it wasn't uncommon to have debates between Jews and Christians out in the streets. And eventually, Jews started being forced into these debates by law. The sense was, okay, you can be a Jew, but you have to wear the circle, you wear a hat or some sort of penitent garb, and then you have to come to these debates and you have to debate us, and you have to watch. Now, the problem is that sometimes these forced debates would have the opposite effect that they were intended, where, for example, the Christian debater would be less educated than the Jewish debater, and the Jewish debater would just wreck him. So this would happen actually again and again, where Christians would try to reproach Jews on certain very esoteric points of theology, and they would say, no, you've got it all wrong. Look, you don't read Hebrew or Aramaic correctly. You aren't acknowledging this within the context of what it was written in. And essentially, Christians started losing these debates. And so what these converso preachers like Petrus Alfonsi did was, in order to confirm their good faith, that they, as converts from Judaism, were no longer Jews and they were really true Christians, they would write these guides on how to debate against Jews. So in the case of Petrus Alfonsi, this took the form of a dialogue between a character named Moses Sephardi, which is his old pre-baptism name, and then the new character, Petrus Alfonsi, who's the Christian. So we have kind of two aspects of his inner self debating against each other. And, Moses Sephardi's character is kind of a straw man for Jews. He doesn't make very strong arguments. He kind of just concedes, and, it's like, yes, Socrates, of course, that sort of thing. But what Petrus Alfonsi does, though, is he says, I would like to slay you with your own sword. And that's a quote. And this becomes kind of a red thread that runs through the Latin polemical tradition. So it starts in the 12th century, and it is Jewish converso writers who are saying, I'm not going to debate you on Christian terms. I'm going to debate you on Jewish terms. So I'm going to try to debate you out of your own religion from within your religion. And this becomes a whole strategy. So what we start to see is the proliferation throughout the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries is of works that have titles like Pugio Fidei, which means the dagger of the faithful, or the Capistrum Judaeorum, the muzzle of the Jews, or the Ensis Pauli, the sword of Paul of Heredia. And so the idea is that these polemical works now are swords that are weapons drawn up from the armories of the Jews. And then those weapons can now be turned against them. Now, these weapons, it doesn't necessarily insinuate a sense of harming so much as like a surgical knife, or a knife for making very precise cuts. So you have public preaching, which is preaching to the mob. You're using language that's accessible to everybody, that everybody can understand, and you're using allegories and fables, and there are certain strategies which you employ when you're preaching to peasants or city people. And then there are very different methods when you are preaching to the Jews, who are learned in the yeshivas. They are literate. They know theology. They know their own books, right? They're a culture that privileges higher learning. And so they need to argue not in these broad rhetorical strokes trying to like move people through pathos or whatever. They need to really get into the nitty-gritty details and say, like, look, you are blind to the correct interpretation of Scripture. Scripture has 4 levels of interpretation at least, and this is a tradition that's shared between Christians and Jews. In the Jewish world, it's called the Pardes, and in the Christian world, it's called the 4 types, or the 4 levels of interpretation, and they're basically equivalent to each other. So at the lowest level, you have the historical or literal level reading of a text. Then you have an allegorical level, and then higher than that, you have a moral level or a tropological level, and then above that, you have a mystical level. And so it's not just that like people are reading a text at the historical or literal level and then saying like, oh, well, we read it at the allegorical level, so we're higher than you. It's more complicated than that. Christians and Jews both had these very complex systems of hermeneutics and use all 4 layers. But what the Christians believed that they had, that the Jews didn't have, is called the spiritual understanding. In Latin, the intelligentsia spiritualis, or the intellectus spiritualis. And you'll see this in Joachim of Fiore. You see this in Petrus Alfonsi. You see this in Ficino, in Pico. You see it's this huge trend of invoking this idea of a spiritual understanding that is something of a grace or a gift of the Holy Spirit. And what this allows you to do is to see correspondences in the Bible. So it's not like a spiritual intelligence, like a Gnostic vision of the eons or something like that. It is the idea that Scripture was revealed and that there is a multi-layered interpretation, so that the revelations were multidimensional. They didn't just have this surface reading. They had many layers. And so from this, they extrapolated that Christians had the spiritual intelligence and could see the correspondences that ran through Scripture. So, for example, Abraham sacrificing his son. This is obviously a prefigurement of God sacrificing Christ. And so that is one pattern. But what these 12th century and 13th century spiritualists would think is that every single thing in the Bible is kind of like a fractal or a jewel that reflects every other passage in the Bible. It's like Indra's web, but in the Bible. Each word, each passage is a hyperlink. And what Christians can do is see the hyperlinks and how the past prefigures the present, and how the present and the past will also prefigure the future. And this is where we get into apocalypticism with Joachim of Fiore, if you want to hear about that, you can go, I think we talked about that the last time I was on the show. So the second Glitch Bottle podcast that I appeared on, we talked about how history and time was kind of constructed of this idea of correspondences in the Bible, and that provided a scaffolding with which to pin more data into history, and that kind of just grew history from that point onward. So there's this idea that Jews are spiritually blind to this spiritual understanding. They don't have the capacity for seeing prefigurations, and how everything in the Old Testament is actually just some sort of metaphysical precursor or prefiguration of an event or a personage in the New Testament. And this eventually became a trope. So, for example, in art, you have the figures synagoga et ecclesia, the synagogue and the church. And so these are two figures often depicted side by side in churches. And what you have is you have ecclesia, who is this kind of triumphant figure, and she's got, a cross and an orb, just looking very triumphant. And then the synagoga, the figure, is a woman who is wearing a blindfold and holding the Ten Commandments upside down, as if to signal that they are blind in their interpretations. They cannot understand, they cannot see the spiritual dimensions of their own theology. So this ties into the mendicant spirituality, and it's kind of a weird and complicated way in which all of this ties in with the Franciscans and the Dominicans. So what's important to know about the Franciscans and the Dominicans is that they developed on the cusp, or rather, as the market economy was generating, some people got really rich, and then some people just got left behind. So before the market economy had come to Europe, there was kind of just widespread poverty, right? But it was only once some people started getting rich that people began to notice that poverty is actually a thing. There are some people who are wealthy cloth merchants, and then there are some people who are lepers living in ditches. And there were a lot of people who felt that you couldn't be a true Christian if you had a lot of wealth. Because if you read the Bible, there's just so many passages in the New Testament where Jesus is kind of this wandering mendicant guy who tells people to sell all their goods and give it to the poor and to own nothing. And there are numerous injunctions to be, quote unquote, apostolically poor. And this, in the 12th century, thanks to Joachim of Fiore, this was believed to be the key to unlock the third status of the Holy Spirit. So history had been ordained that there was an era of the Father, which was the era of the biblical Israelites and the Hebrews. And then there was an era of the Son, which was the era of the New Testament. And then there was an era of the Holy Spirit. And this was supposed to be the era of the mendicants, when everybody would see the light of Christ, give up all of their possessions, own nothing, and then everybody would sort of roll over into this new plane of existence whereby property no longer existed, and we were all sort of bound together by fraternal love and charity. It's this really earthly utopia that was read into the millennium, the 1,000-year return of Christ before the end of the world. And so there were a lot of attempts then to convert Jews and to bring them into this knowledge of the Spirit as an attempt to immanentize the end, because the Bible said that at the end, the Jews would come in to the church, and then united Christians and Jews together would create this third status. So there were all these beliefs about the necessity of immanentizing the eschaton, as we call it, of going out and trying to convert the Jews in order that the new age of history might come about. And so there were a lot of mendicants who got involved in this mission of preaching to the Jews, using their own weapons, using their own esoteric minutiae. So a major player in this is a character named Raymond Marty. He used extensive passages of Petrus Alfonsi in his book, and it's called the Pugio Fidei, the dagger of the faithful. And so the idea was that he was established to set up a committee of Dominican friars, and he led a translation school, basically to try to teach people how to learn Hebrew in order to debate with Jews in Hebrew, or rather in using biblical arguments that were rooted in the original Hebrew, not just St. Jerome's Vulgate, right? Because the Jews were like, we don't read that translation. It's a terrible translation. Like, everything is wrong. St. Jerome was not as erudite as you like to imagine that he was. And so they said, okay, well, we won't use St. Jerome anymore. We will actually try to use the Hebrew original. And Raymond Marty, who himself was possibly a converso, so he was a Catalan Dominican, and he in 1270 put together this guide made up of a lot of Petrus Alfonsi's work on how to debate Jews in public, like Nachmanides. And so before the show started, I sent to you, Alex, a video called The Disputation. It's a movie from, I think, the 80s about Rabbi Nachmanides in debate with the converso Dominican Pablo Cristiani. And it's a good movie. It's an hour, and it really captures the character and the spirit. You can see it on YouTube. Just search The Disputation. And that'll give you a kind of sense of what it was like. You have the king who's sitting in his throne, and then you have the courtroom, and then you have the local Kabbalists come in. They debate with the local Dominican as to whether the Messiah has come or whether the Messiah will come. These sorts of questions, whether God is a unique being or a united being, or is he a Trinity? These are the sorts of debates that they're having. And again, Pablo Cristiani, in this case, he basically loses. Like, his arguments are not very good. That's like a devastating blow, is to see these converso Jews who are supposed to be equipped with the best arguments and the best tools to defeat their former co-religionists, and they get annihilated. So Raymond Marty, the Dominican, he puts together this guide, the Pugio Fidei, and it deals with all manner of Talmudic esotericism. So since it's 1270, we're right in the century that Kabbalah is becoming a thing, at least in the sense that we understand it with the Sephirot and the divine names. There's the ecstatic Kabbalah, or the prophetic Kabbalah as it's called, and then there are more kind of mainstream Kabbalah forms that are more having to do with halakhic matters. So, when you perform mitzvah, you change the supernal world. You are causing or affecting change in the higher realms. And so that gave sort of weight to Jewish ritual, where Jews who, were largely living scattered, they had reasons to maintain their commandments and to perform those 613 commandments that are in the Torah, because each commandment that you fulfilled, it affected things in the higher world. It had like a quasi-magical change. They wouldn't call it magical. We can get to that later in the Renaissance. This becomes a whole debate, but we'll come back to that. So the thing about Raymond Marty is that his book then gets picked up by a lot of other authors. And so we have this whole chain of converso mendicants, of Jews who've converted, and instead of becoming lay people, they actually become apostolically poor mendicant friars. And so you might wonder, why is this? And what I've speculated is that because mendicant spirituality was sort of formed as a shadow cast by the market economy, it's an inversion of the marketplace. And because Christian stereotypes of Jews, for good reasons, involve the marketplace, because Jews could move through these porous boundaries because of their language. They could trade with Arabs. They had extensive trade networks abroad with other Jews. So Jews were often associated with the marketplace and with trade and with money. And the Mendicants were an inversion of that type of worldview. They renounced money. They couldn't touch it. They couldn't own property. They owned nothing. And so the conversos, as a sign of their good faith, became mendicants because they didn't want people to think, oh, he just converted because he wanted to keep his property. That's an accusation that you hear slung all the time, is that these men only converted for material good because there were such pressures being exerted on the Jewish people at that particular time. So in 1391 or in 1492, or these pivotal dates in the suppression of the Jews in Europe, they had their properties confiscated and they were forced to convert. But if you converted, then you would be accused by all of your former co-religionists that you only did it for material reasons. And by becoming a mendicant, you could sort of get rid of that accusation. You could say, there's no way that I converted to Christianity in order to become a more successful businessman. I took up the brown cowl that is just patched together, and I went and I preached to the lepers. So you can't say that I did this purely for material gain. And that was really persuasive, right? Like, that is a way of demonstrating your good faith. And so these men who converted and became mendicant monks often became writers. And there are two main works that I've been looking at in some detail. And the writer is Paulus of Burgos, or sometimes you might hear him called Paulus Bergensis. And he was a Jewish writer along with another one named Jerome of Santa Fe, or Hieronymus of Santa Fe. These two guys formed, in using the works of writers that came before them, like Petrus Alfonsi, like Raymond Marty, they put together their own anti-Jewish works that were very influential in the 14th century, which was the main century where we have a lot of anti-Jewish action from European rulers. And a big influence on them was the mendicant spirituality, especially of Thomas Aquinas and of Dionysius the Areopagite, and these kinds of mendicant or monastic thinkers who have these very elaborate visions of the cosmos with angels, and very influenced by Platonism and Aristotelianism of the day. And so they incorporated all of these things, and often their debates with the Jews are on these kinds of philosophical issues. And what this all leads up to, in my case, and as far as my research is concerned, is it leads up to Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. Now, these two Renaissance men are often thought of as, thanks to Francis Yates, they're thought of as Renaissance magi. They're often thought of as humanists, as very sort of forward-looking, modern type people. I don't know. There's this projection of this ecumenical tolerationism into Pico and Marsilio Ficino that is there, but it's more complicated than things appear. And so what I'm arguing in my research is that Pico and Ficino need to be understood in light of this Latin polemical anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, and anti-pagan tradition. So we often think of these guys as being pro-pagan, pro-Kabbalah, pro-Islam, and that is true in some regards. But what they're doing is they are reading all of those things in order to use the weapons of the Jews, Muslims, and pagans against them. It's all a giant endeavor to try not only to demonstrate their own good faith, but to create a universalizing, let's say, Platonic form of Christianity, that this is the religion that Jesus Christ himself practiced. This is the philosophy that he himself believed in. And what you'll find is that to Ficino, this was basically a kind of pseudo-Dionysian Neoplatonism. And for Ficino, it was that as well, but it was also fueled by Kabbalah. So the idea was that Moses was the Platonic philosopher par excellence, and that he had encoded in the book of Genesis, through the many tiers of interpretation, you can detect that, well, for Pico, there were 7 levels or layers of interpretation that could be read. And so he saw that all of the New Testament, all of Christ, all of the end times, everything had been prefigured and ordered in the first few chapters of Genesis. And so he demonstrates all of the correspondences. So, for example, the sun and the moon is Christ and the church, and the firmament is the law, and the law separates the darkness of chaos from the light. And, you know, the sun rises in the firmament, and it doesn't destroy the law, but it fulfills the law. And so you have all of these very analogical or spiritual readings that Pico is doing. This is in the Heptapolis, which is his commentary on the 6 days of creation. But with Ficino, what we have is the De Christiana Religione, which is a work that currently myself and a team of translators comprising of Brett Bartlett and David Pareca are translating. And this is a very important work of Ficino's, but it's very little known. And probably the reason that it is little known is that realistically, most Ficino translations have only happened in the last 20 or so years, maybe 30 years, especially the 3 books on life, which is like the major one that people think of when they think of Ficino. It's like a kind of his own personal Picatrix or Secretum Secretorum that he wrote for Cosimo de' Medici, and it's on how to live a long life. So that's one work that he wrote rather late in his life, and that has a lot of Hermeticism and magic and talismans and celestial intelligences and things like that. And so people usually, when they think of Ficino, they think of this work. Now, the De Christiana Religione is a different kind of beast entirely. It was written decades before the De Vita Libri Tres. It was written in 1474, which is just coming on the heels of Ficino's 18-book publication of his refutation of Averroes, which is called the Platonic Theology on the Immortality of the Soul. So he was so appalled by the presence of Averroes in the universities, whether through the rationalism of Maimonides in Jewish culture, he just did not want to deal with these ideas whereby the soul was essentially exterminated upon death. It reabsorbed into a kind of oversoul. And that idea really didn't jive with Ficino. And what he thought was that it was Plato. We need to resurrect the works of Plato. We need to translate the works of Plato, because Plato has the key to our religion, which the Jews and the Muslims do not understand because they don't have the spiritual intelligence. They don't have the spiritual understanding. They deny this spiritual aspect, which is that the soul lives on after death. It does not get just dissolved, and that we are individual souls. We each have our own individual spark, and that through, you know, the penitential cycle, which is very important in Catholicism, we can become reunited with God. We can ascend through the layers of the heavenly hierarchy of the angels, and we can ascend through the virtues that those angels exhibit. And mankind also is an angel of sorts. You know, angel is a label for a spirit, and we too are spirits, and we belong in that cosmic hierarchy, and our corresponding virtue is love. Each of the angels have their own corresponding virtues. Ours is caritas. And by embodying caritas, by burning with love, essentially, we can become one with God again, or at least reunited in his courtroom with the angels. And so this becomes a big thing for Ficino, whereby he needs Platonism to do battle against the scholastic Aristotelianism, Averroism, Maimonideism, what have you, and reassert that Christianity is correct because it asserts that we have this divine spark that lives on and goes and dwells with the angels. And in putting together his arguments for De Christiana Religione, what we find is that it's like half a prologue for his 18-book Platonic theology, but it happens to be an adversus Judaios work. So this work on the Christian religion that he is putting together to try to be this kind of introduction, the capstone to his 18-book collection, he's saying, I'm going to use this book, and it is an anti-Jewish polemic. And it is largely drawn up of sources from the Church Fathers and from these guys that I've mentioned, namely Jerome of Santa Fe and Paulus Burgensis, or Paul of Burgos. And these guys are drawing upon Raymond Marty and Petrus Alfonsi. So we see this long chain of authors, of converso mendicants. Although, Petrus Alfonsi was not a mendicant himself, he was certainly a converso, and he then influenced many mendicants in the century after his death. And then this becomes a sort of spiritual understanding of Christendom. And what I would argue is that this is what culminates in the Christian interpretation of Kabbalah. And now I say Christian interpretation of Kabbalah and not Christian Kabbalah to try to stay in the good graces of academia, because Joseph Blau, who was a historian of Kabbalah in the Renaissance, he was a student of Gershom Scholem, he wrote a book in the first half of the 20th century on the Christian interpretation of Kabbalah. And he's very clear to make a distinction between the fact that there is Kabbalah proper, which is, it just means reception, and that is Jewish esoteric tradition passed down, is just a wide body of literature. And then we can get into it later. There's different kinds of Kabbalah. But in the Christian interpretation of Kabbalah, really what we're looking at is an extension of the Latin polemical tradition, whereby Christians are using Jewish concepts, esoteric minutiae, and then using them against the Jews. Now, in Ficino, we have what I would call Talmudic esotericism. So he's relying on guys like Nicholas of Lyra, who himself was reading Rashi or Rabbi Solomon Yitzhaki or Maimonides. So there was this long tradition of Franciscans arguing against Jewish philosophers, and Ficino is tapping into these things, but he never really addresses Kabbalah. Not explicitly, at least. That's what changes with Pico. So Pico della Mirandola is the very first Christian Kabbalist, and he gets his Kabbalism from a sort of idiosyncratic blend of what was taught to him by his teachers. And his teachers, some of which were Jewish conversos. So his major teachers were Elia del Medico, who was an Aristotelian, not a Kabbalist. He still managed to pique Pico's interest in Hebrew studies, though, so that kind of got him on one track. Then we have Flavius Mithridates, who was a Jew who converted to Christianity, and Flavius Mithridates, we know for a fact from a sermon that he gave, was very familiar with the Pugio Fidei and used arguments against Judaism that were drawn from the Pugio Fidei, and these were impressed on Pico. Lastly, the teacher that blended Kabbalah and astral magic, or nigromancia, is Johann Alemano, who was Pico's last teacher. They were all translators and humanists in their own right, but they all had different approaches to Kabbalah and how it interacted with magic and how it interacted with Platonism and Aristotelianism, whether they were Jewish or Christian. And so all of these weird, strange confluence of influences comes into Pico, and he puts together the 900 Theses, and he's trying to say, look, what I'm trying to do is create the perfect form of Christianity in these 900 arguments. These 900 statements should create this kind of, ideological jewel that will essentially immanentize the eschaton. It is the transcendental object at the end of time, to use the Terence McKenna language. And what he's trying to do is fuse Kabbalah and Christian metaphysics, especially in that vein of Pseudo-Dionysius, and trying to reconcile them to each other to create that perfect doctrine that will usher in the end times and convert all of the Jews. So we don't necessarily need to think of Pico della Mirandola as, like hippies when they were in the 70s and they would do some acid and then they were like, man, I need to go and move to India. And they would just become obsessed with Indian culture. And then they would kind of go native and become like the Indians. That's often a vision that people have of Pico with the Jews, that he just got so immersed in Judaism and he loved it so much that he needed to immerse himself in it. So there's a little bit of that, but it's also mostly just this anti-Jewish polemical tradition that he's tapping into, and that he's really drawing on Kabbalah, on the use of divine names. We can get into the details if you want. And he's trying to create this picture where he's saying, look, you guys don't even understand your own Kabbalah. Not only are you interpretively blind to the Old Testament and to the Talmud and how it's heretical, you're also blind to your own mystical works like the Sefer Yetzirah or the Zohar. You misunderstand the Trinitarian prefigurements that are in, let's say, the triad of Keter, Chokmah, and Binah. And that, for example, the Tiferet is the Logos incarnate, while the disincarnate Logos is Chokmah, right? So you have this way of preserving the Christian Trinity and the many names of God, the many aspects of God, like the Lord of Hosts, for example. These names now all have a place, and they are all united on the Tree of Life. And they all are signs of the unicity of God, but also his manifold aspects. And so he's saying, Jews understand this, that God has so many different divine names, and these are representative of different processes within the divine, but they do not recognize the Trinitarian nature of all of this. And now this kind of brings us full circle. What I wanted to mention, maybe before moving on to some other questions, is this idea of the Tetragrammaton, which obviously, as your listeners know well, is a critical part of ritual magic. And that the Tetragrammaton was actually totally unknown in the West before Petrus Alfonsi. So the idea is that the four-letter name of God, the Yod-He, Vav-He, was only pronounced on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, in the temple, when the temple was extant, and that this was a sort of grand mystery that the high priest would pronounce the name of God, and that was the wonder-working word. Through the name of God, you could perform miracles, healing, what have you. So that name was lost. And in Petrus Alfonsi, because he was a Sephardic Jew who knew Hebrew, he actually resurrected in the Latin world, and he said, look, we have in his polemic, in the Dialogi contra Judaios, what we call a scutum fidei, a shield of faith. And it's a triangle, and it has three sides, and each side of the triangle, or each tip of the triangle rather, has one pair of the letters in the Tetragrammaton. So these are Latinizations. So we have the Yod, He, and then we have the He and the Vav, and then we have the Vav and the He. But they're Latin letters, right? So it's like I, E, E, V, V, E. And this is the first instance where Petrus Alfonsi is saying, look, Jews, you don't even recognize the Trinitarian structure of the name of God. There's this rotating set of pairs of letters in the four-letter name of God. And each pair of letters is attributed to a different aspect of the Godhead. And so this gets carried on into Joachim of Fiore. Petrus Alfonsi and Joachim of Fiore probably met. They probably knew each other. And Joachim of Fiore's entire three-status theory of history is based on the unfurlment of the letters of the Tetragrammaton in history. So the age of the Father has its own pair of letters, the age of the Son has its own pair of letters, and the age of the Holy Spirit has its own pair of letters. And he believed that history was essentially the process of unfoldment of this letterist mystery. And from Petrus Alfonsi and from Joachim of Fiore, Pico takes up this idea that Joachim of Fiore was very familiar with this idea called formal mathematics. And to Pico, this was like a privileged form of mathematics that was not the mercantile mathematics of the marketplace. This is not like money math. This was divine Pythagorean math. And now remember that Hebrew letters are numbers. So to him, lettrism and Pythagorean numerology became one thing. And what he was trying to do was to use these arguments that Petrus Alfonsi had used, that Raymond Marty had used, that Joachim of Fiore had used, but to do them even better, to actually use Hebrew and not Latin, to actually engage with Kabbalah, which nobody had done yet, and to demonstrate that these kind of polemical points can be found in Kabbalistic thinking as well. And so that eventually gets on into Reuchlin, where Reuchlin is trying to find the mystery of the wonder-working word. And he's trying to prove the Trinity, of course, and something that he thinks of in his lettrist manner of thinking, that the signifier and the signified are somehow united in some real way that isn't just learned, it's actually intrinsic. The letter She in Hebrew is this three-pronged letter with three heads, and they're united at one base. And so he thought, this is the letter of the Spirit. This is the letter that demonstrates the three parts of God that are united at the base into one being. And so he took the She and he stuck it in the middle of the four vowels of the Tetragrammaton. So it was Yod, He, Sh, Vav, He. And in that he saw the name Yeshua, Jesus. So he confirmed the mystery of the name of Christ and how it could be used as effective in ritual purposes, in magic and so forth, in miracles. And it is through the power of his name, which is the divine logos, which is the name of God. So the idea was that the She makes the name of God, the unpronounceable name of God, pronounceable. It's the Sh puts the air that blows the wind through the lifeless or mute name of God. And so you can see how, like, if you're the type of person who has the belief in the spiritual intelligence, you're seeing all these correspondences fire off between all of these things. Like the She has the trifold nature, and it is the letter that represents the breath, and it brings the spiritual life into the lifeless letter that the Jews uphold. And so these become very complex currents. And there's a lot of ways that we could kind of discursively unpack this stuff. But I think that gives you a sort of overview. I'm not going to call it brief since I rambled for, I don't know, an hour now. But that gives you a sense of how the Latin polemical tradition unfolded and how men like Ficino and Pico, as much as they were novel and cutting edge, were also really looking back on a tradition. And they were really trying to affirm a mode of discourse, or a polemical mode of discourse, in trying to come up with this perfected form of apocalyptic Christianity.
Well, Dan, I think your research is absolutely very informative, and it's very important in, as you've touched on previously, in kind of tracing or bringing to light these very powerful currents, and currents that might be hidden but do have, as you've mentioned, that kind of, anti-Jewish approach. And obviously this is a very important topic. This is a very heavy topic, and as has been discussed elsewhere, obviously, the Jewish people have had to struggle with anti-Semitism and kind of battle those tropes, as you've mentioned, in large part because in many cases they were more educated and had more financial security. And they've been battling this for thousands of years. And as you mentioned, kind of looking back, we say, what? This is appalling and crazy. Jewish converts to Christianity and other Christians, as you mentioned, were effectively forcing, members of the Jewish community to have debates about their own theology, which, as you said, in some cases, the Christian debaters just got smoked, just demolished by the more informed Jewish debaters. This kind of touches on something that I've been wondering as you've been sharing, which is during this time, when there are these well-known officials or well-known historical figures going into the Jewish community and saying things like, hold on, very educated and informed Jewish historical figure, you don't understand the Trinitarian structure of the name of God. Was there a Jewish response to this? Was there, obviously I'd imagine it would be disagreement, but what did that dialogue look like?
So that's actually a great question, because the answer is counterintuitive. There isn't really many responses, because most of the time the polemical documents, the Adversus Judaios literature, was not usually written to be sent to Jews. It was written, again, by Jews most of the time, by conversos, who then wanted to demonstrate their own good faith. So they were writing these guides for other Christians on how to debate Jews, but they weren't addressing those to Jews. So it was kind of like a Christian circle jerk, or preaching to the choir is the metaphor that is most commonly used. And these guys were definitely preaching to the choir. And so there is no real response from within Jewish circles, because they didn't take it seriously. And then, those that did take it seriously, they converted and became these kind of great polemical figures who, they were writers. The problem is they also got involved with kings and local rulers and started putting out rules for what are the best ways that we can prescribe Jewish activity or get rid of their rights, or what are ways that we can hamper Jews. And so there was a lot of that going on as well. So those who cared converted, and those who didn't care didn't respond.
So many listeners, Dan, are familiar to that point with the kind of Jewish Kabbalistic system, and as you mentioned, the Christian interpretation of the Jewish Kabbalistic system, but also the kind of Christian Kabbalah. So can you tell us, with all of these discussions going on and all of these different tributaries about how to argue theology and how to argue Talmudic esotericism, what was the actual goal and the focus? Was it, as you said, to kind of bring about this flowering of this kind of new Christian Kabbalistic interpretation that would transform everything? Or were there other more subtle esoteric goals? Can you kind of put this in context for us?
I think we need to take it on a case-by-case basis for the most part. At the very least, we can divide between the Dominicans and the Franciscans. The Franciscans were far more influenced by these apocalyptic Joachimite currents that were about the fusion of Jew and Gentile throughout history, and then the culmination of Christian universalism at the end of time. You know, you even see the same thing in Abraham Abulafia, who believed that Jew and Christian would be submerged at the end of time into a new thing. So Abulafia picked up through the Franciscans that were missionizing to Jews basically this idea of radical ecumenicalism, but instead of subordinating all things to Christ at the end of time, they would all just be subordinate to one sort of new religion in the unity of God. But the Dominicans were, from their inception, they were intended to be preachers to the Cathars, at least when they first started. And in debating with the Cathars, eventually they exterminated the Cathars, and they had this machine in southern France and in Spain that was designed for preaching to heretics. Well, thanks to Petrus Alfonsi, who, you know, blew the whistle, so to speak, on local Jews in Spain, he said, look, these aren't what you think they are. These are not the Hebrews of the Bible who are just following the old law of the Old Testament. These are a new religion of rabbinic Judaism, which was like formulated in the 6th century and comes way later than Christianity, and therefore is a novelty. It is non-biblical, and therefore what do we do with people who are like us but slightly different from us? They're heretics. They're not pagans anymore. They're just straight up heretics. And so this gave the right to rulers to persecute Jews, whereas before they had sort of fallen in line with the Augustinian position, which was, don't worry about the Jews. They'll all convert at the end of time anyways. Like, you don't have to do anything. It'll just happen on its own. But then when you have these more immanentizing apocalyptic schemes that say, like, no, we are the players on the stage of history and we need to immanentize the eschaton, we have to go out and we have to preach the Jews, and that's our responsibility. That's the Great Commission. Then you get the mendicants, like the Dominicans, going after Jewish groups. So for the mendicants, that was kind of their raison d'etre from the beginning, was to convert heretics. And since Jews had been recategorized as heretics, they weren't just following the Old Testament anymore. That sort of made them free game for hunting. And so you can see why, like, Jews would really hate people like Petrus Alfonsi, because they left Judaism and then they really opened the floodgates for very strong anti-Semitic currents in Europe that led to expulsions, that led to pogroms, that led to forcing people to wear the yellow circle or to kick them out of society, or blood libel stories, these kinds of things. Now, we mentioned Jerome of Santa Fe, and a lot of people are familiar with Martin Luther's work on the Jews and their lies. It's like a perennial classic of European anti-Semitism in history class. And most of what Luther says, he's actually drawing from Jerome of Santa Fe. So Martin Luther's, the bulk of his arguments are drawn from one of these converso Dominicans who then starts arguing against Jews. And then Martin Luther's anti-Semitism and really the anti-Semitism of Spain as a whole sort of really takes off in the 16th century. And that's, you know, where we locate figures like Reuchlin and his debates with local inquisitors as to the value of Hebrew literature, of the Talmud and things like that. Whereas you have the Dominicans who are trying to squash out Hebrew learning. Men like Reuchlin are saying, like, look, our fate as Christians is inextricably intertwined with Judaism. If you extirpate Hebrew learning, how would we ever be able to read our scriptures in the original sense that they were intended? And remember, this is the center of the humanist era, where everybody is trying to return ad fontes, back to the source, to try to get this pristine form of what was intended by the author. Texts are not these, you know, malleable traditions anymore. They're They were written once in a perfect form, and that can be recovered. And so Reuchlin is thinking, if we persecute the Jews and we drive them out of Europe, how will we ever be able to analyze the scriptures correctly? And that's really a current that you see that's caused by the Latin polemical tradition, by the genres like Pugio Fidei, where we're using these very precise arguments and grammatical arguments in order to dismantle our opponent's thoughts.
What were, Dan, to that point, some of the similarities and common sources that the Jewish Kabbalistic system and the Christian Kabbalistic system drew from? And then also separately, what are some of the things that not only set them apart, but a very important theme that you've touched on again and again, which is understanding each of these systems on their own terms?
Right. So, like I mentioned, there were different branches of Kabbalah. Within Jewish Kabbalah, again, the word just means reception. And so it's like reception of what? There's a certain tradition of texts that were passed on, and these were usually esoteric or mystical interpretations of scripture, or, commentaries on things like the Song of Songs. But there are different brands of Kabbalah, and Nachmanides' Kabbalah, for example, the figure who debated against Pablo Cristiani, was rooted in halakhic matters. It was rooted in the performance of laws and doing commandments. And so, for example, you get the 10 Commandments and you look at them, it says, honor your mother and father. These are not just saying, like, don't do bad things that upset your parents. You can invert these commandments, and it's like, what does honoring your mother and father look like in the active sense? You are, sending your mother a birthday card or whatever it is that your mother likes when you do those things. Or that in and of itself is like a good deed that causes some sort of change in the supernal world, in the primordial man, in the Adam Kadmon, if you will, which is the archetypal form of man, the supernal body that's in Platonic space outside of our own space. And you can affect changes in this world. So the commandments say, do not murder. What is the inversion of that? Well, it's creating life. So go create life. And that is a mitzvah. And you will affect change in not only this world, but you will affect change in the higher worlds. You will be blessed by these deeds that you do. And so you see how the very basic religious life becomes this theurgical symphony. Everything you do is tied in with theurgical processes. And so that was really what Kabbalah looked like, let's say, in the 13th century. But then along comes people like Abraham Abulafia, who takes the study of divine names and gets into these ideas of, whirling the names, the ars combinatoria, and really getting into ecstatic states and prophetic states, and using the letterism of the Bible and gematria and things like that. Abulafia eventually thought that he was the Messiah, and that he was bringing about this system that could reconcile Christians and Jews together. Because again, Abulafia is living in an environment where Franciscans and Dominicans are coming up to him and debating with him all the time, but not everybody's polarized. There's an exchange of ideas, and the spiritual Franciscans, influenced by Joachim of Fiore, they have an impact on Abulafia, and that has an impact on the prophetic or ecstatic Kabbalah, it's a very different kind of Kabbalah. It's focused on divine names. It's not so much focused on the mitzvot. And then what Pico does in his Christian interpretation of the Kabbalah is he merges the divine names and the Sephirot together and really makes the divine name part the most important part of Kabbalah. So right there, Pico is emphasizing an aspect or a facet of Kabbalah which is not all that present in Jewish circles because it was practiced by Abulafia, who was a false messiah, right? Like, there are lots of subtle differences. There are also influences that come into Pico from figures like Raymond Lull and Arnold of Villanova, who were not Kabbalists, but were really rooted in Neoplatonic thinking. And they thought, look, what can Jews, Christians, and Muslims all agree on? That God is one, that God is good, that God is infinitely creative. And so men like Raymond Lull built entire systems, like computation systems. Eventually Leibniz would come to study Raymond Lull's Ars Combinatoria as his doctoral thesis, and that would eventually fuel the development of computers and calculation machines. And it was based on this idea of what is this emanating God doing, this alpha and omega spewing out virtues. Like, if God is good, then he's making all these combinations of positive virtues. There are some combinations that God can't make because God is good, so he's limited by his goodness. But other than that, you can actually like construct the whole world like a computer from calculating the emanations of God's goodness from these combinatorial systems. And so really under the surface, between the Christian Kabbalah and the Jewish Kabbalah is obviously the prophetic books and the Torah and the scriptures and so forth, but Platonic philosophy is really important. And it can't be stressed how much both of those currents, they're like two plants in a container. And if you pull on the stem of one plant, you know, it starts to uproot the other one because their roots are all tangled together. They look like two separate plants on the surface, but when you start chasing far down enough, you see that there's like a lot of mutual influence.
Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating. And it's interesting regarding, as you mentioned, Dan, the primacy given to the divine names and the combining or the synthesis with the Sephiroth of the Tree of Life, because I know that many listeners would be familiar with that. For example, whether you're talking about the sphere of Saturn and Bina, there's a divine name associated with that, or Tippereth, or Hod, or Yesod. So this was one example of many departures that to this system is a synthesis that makes it better, but in another system, there was not that strong of an association between a sphere or a Sephiroth and a divine name, for example.
Right. I think that it does precede Pico, but Pico really flips the emphasis. And then that gets picked up in systems, you know, later magical systems, which your audience would be probably more familiar with than me, like the Golden Dawn, Kabbalistic systems and things like that, where we have the Tree of Life, and it's got these various names associated with different Sephirot. Those were different systems that got overlapped over top of each other in the Renaissance. And it was a way of demonstrating the unicity of God, that God is one, but he is one insofar as he is the sum of all his parts. That was a big problem, was that the Sephirot is kind of like flirting with paganism in a way. And then the Kabbalists would say, oh, no. God is one. The Sephirot are just apertures into which we can see the one light. But the light, as it comes out the different apertures, appears manifold. They're different angles at which we see the light, but the light is ultimately one. They're shells, right? The kli. That's the language that the Kabbalists use, is that really there is light, and there is the transmissive force, and there is the shell, the kli, and the receptive force. And everything in the universe is either transmitting or receiving. And Kabbalah is the science of receiving. You put yourself in a receptive mode where you become an empty vessel and you allow the light to come in and fill you up. Now, notice how similar this language is to the language in Pseudo-Dionysius, with the angelic hierarchies and the light cascading down out from the one and being colored by the different virtues. And so these are two different systems entirely that didn't really mutually interact until the Renaissance, but both of them are rooted in this idea of, first off, divine emanation. They're rooted in the oneness of God, and how as you ascend up toward God, things become more rarefied, things become simpler. there are fewer and fewer shells as you go up into the light. And that's something that you get from Plato. It's something that the Neoplatonists read in Plato. As much as Jews want to think that their tradition is purely Jewish and has no influence from Hellenistic sources who are their historical mortal enemies through things like the Book of Maccabees and so forth. And then as much as Christians don't want to admit that they are also rooted in certain Platonic ideas, they'll highlight some minutiae and see like, look, the Platonists don't suffer the logos to become flesh, therefore Christianity is not Platonic at all. And it's like, look, you're using the same language to talk about these concepts that was around for 500-600 years before Christianity was around. You know, you have Heraclitus talking about the logos, and presumably he's getting it from maybe Zoroastrian concepts of truth, Asher. So it's a really long tradition, and Ficino kind of saw through that, and that's what he was trying to think with his Prisca Theologia. Instead of seeing that Platonism is some philosophy that's at the roots of all these systems, he sees Christianity is the original religion, and that Judaism is obviously like a misguided tail end product that started, you know, well after the fall of the Second Temple, well after the 1st century AD, but that the religion of St. Paul and of Dionysius the Areopagite, that is what everybody is tapping into, and that is the philosophy of Christ. That is like what, when he was on earth, he believed certain things, and what he believed was essentially Platonism. But Ficino didn't know that at the time. He saw them as inversed, right? That Proclus ripped off Pseudo-Dionysius, not the other way around. Lorenzo Valla, through his philological work, was saying, look, it's impossible for this Dionysius figure to be the contemporary of Paul. He's probably some 6th century Syrian mystic. And look, there's like passages of Proclus that are like repeated in Dionysius. And so Ficino had access to that knowledge, but he still maintained that Dionysius was the original friend of the Apostle Paul. He had the visions of the angelic hierarchies, and that Proclus basically just ripped them off. The Neoplatonists ripped Christianity off. So that's what they thought in the Renaissance. A lot of people will think Ficino was this figure who wanted to embolden Christianity with Neoplatonism, and that's true, but he wasn't doing it because he liked Neoplatonism. He was doing it because he liked Christianity, and he wanted Christianity to be able to defend itself against Aristotelian criticisms from, say, the supporters of Averroes or the supporters of Maimonides.
Well, that's one of the fascinating things about your research, Dan, is that it really does show not only tracing these kind of historical tributaries, but also showing how you could have a tradition, and to your point about the apertures, people and historical figures and scholars and theologians literally seeing something completely different, even though it might be a very similar tradition. And in addition to that, you talk a lot about Petrus Alfonsi and kind of the influence of Petrus Alfonsi in these currents. Can you touch, Dan, just on, people like Adelard of Bath and some of the different specific texts on astral magic and astronomy, and Adelard of Bath being a major student of Petrus Alfonsi? What would you like listeners to briefly know about that?
Right. So we've been talking so far mostly about esotericism with its aspect toward theology, things like divine names, Sephirot, and Lettrism, and so forth. Now, another aspect of Petrus Alfonsi that makes him so important to occultists is that he was a physician and an astronomer, and he brought with him out of Andalusia, out of the Arabic world, into France and England, updated information about astrology. In the 11th, 12th century, knowledge in Europe was fairly limited, and they had certain works like Macrobius's Dream of Scipio, for example. They had some Ptolemy tables, but these were riddled with errors, and they didn't give a complete picture. And so Petrus Alfonsi, when he came into the European world, he wrote things like the Epistola ad Peripateticos against the Peripatetics, or to the Peripatetics, sometime around 1116, and he tried to convince the schoolmen of the universities to take up Arabic learning. So he's saying, like, look, I know that these people are, they're heretics. They're not Christians. They're like a breakaway of Christianity from some time ago, but they have the best math. What he was looking at was the tables of Al-Khwarizmi. Now, Al-Khwarizmi is famous for bringing the Indian numerals through Arabic into the Latin world. Appears in Picatrix, for example. He was also, Al-Khwarizmi, not going to say invented, but brought the zero from India into Europe. And this was done through Petrus Alfonsi. And so Petrus Alfonsi, not only was he a theologian, he was also a physician and an astronomer. And he wanted to make sure that the Christendom had better tools to be on par with their religious rivals. And he also wrote on the astrolabe, for example, and even the Adversus Judaios book, like when you read it, when you actually like go through it, he's not arguing against Jews necessarily on theological matters as much as on matters scientific. Like there are diagrams with the sun going around the earth, and he's making certain arguments against claims in the Bible, saying that their interpretation is irrational and that his interpretation is rational. So there's a strong rationalizing impetus in his works. And they even tie into the science of the day, and that was sort of unusual. So for Adelard of Bath, what we have is that Adelard of Bath gets taught by Petrus Alfonsi, or at least reads some of his works, and influential so to him are these tables of Al-Khwarizmi for his astrological calculations. Another work which was important to Adelard of Bath was the Liber Prestigiorum. And the Liber Prestigiorum is known to the Latin West through the Speculum Astronomiae. The Speculum Astronomiae traditionally is ascribed to Roger Bacon or Albertus Magnus, and it's neither of these guys. It was probably a guy named Richard of Fournival. But in any case, the authorship doesn't matter. What matters is that the Speculum Astronomiae comes out in the 1260s in this period of great debate at the University of Paris. Now, there were a lot of debates at the universities. These were debate factories. That's literally all they did, was just debate stuff all the time. And one thing that they were debating was the presence of Aristotelianism in the curriculum. How important was it to incorporate the works of pagan philosophers when teaching Christian theology? And this is why, Thomas Aquinas is so significant, because he found this perfect synthesis that balanced some of the more radical elements or anti-Christian elements of Aristotelianism. And he mixed a bunch of different strains of thought and made something palatable to the Christian West. But before that, there were a lot of debates as to what was acceptable magic, or what was idolatry or blasphemy or what have you. And so the Liber Prestigiorum is referenced in the Speculum Astronomiae, and this was the very first work, other than the Asclepius, which had never disappeared from the Latin West. This was the very first work to come into the Latin West that mentioned Hermes Trismegistus. Now, the Speculum Astronomiae would call the Liber Prestigiorum blasphemous. They would dismiss it. But the original work is Thabit ibn Qurra's De Imaginibus. And that was eventually translated by John of Seville. And that version of basically the same text, but from a different translation, it receives favorable treatment because it gets printed in at least 46 copies. So we barely know anything about the Liber Prestigiorum, but then the De Imaginibus is everywhere. And that's really a kind of a favorite of astral magic in the medieval period and the Renaissance. Bits of it appear in the Picatrix, for example. And so, yeah, Adelard and the controversies at the university, these are all connected together back to Petrus Alfonsi. So we see that not only are there debates about theology and Kabbalah and theological esotericism, but there's also debates about astrology, about astronomy, astral magic, and whether these things are acceptable or blasphemous. To what extent should we accept these because they're foreign? These are all the kinds of debates that we start to see at the University of Paris in the 1260s. And so we can't underestimate the importance of Petrus Alfonsi in esotericism, because barely anybody knows about him. I did a YouTube search before having this talk. I just wanted to see if there was anything else about Petrus Alfonsi. There's nothing, not a single video on YouTube other than like a rendering of a Wikipedia page by machine reading. And yet, this guy altered the course of history in terms of relations with Christians and Jews. He altered the course of science when it comes to giving more accurate astronomical tables to the West. And he's just fundamental to European apocalypticism through the Tetragrammaton that he passed on to Joachim of Fiore. That there's so many weird connections that go back to Petrus Alfonsi, and it blows my mind that I'm one of the first people. I mean, I know that there's a whole school of scholars dedicated to studying just Petrus Alfonsi, but they're usually looking at him on his own terms as opposed to seeing his influence throughout the centuries. It's usually not something that most historians do, is take a multi-century span of time and study that. Usually you lose a lot of the details when you do that, and historians like to think that if you don't specialize, you've got nothing. But I like to imagine that in order to get a better understanding of Pico and Ficino, we need to show them in the light of their medieval precursors as much as all the people that came after them.
To that point too, Dan, and you've touched on this just now, but as listeners absorb this, what are some of the other things, the other big takeaways about not only this period in time or about Alfonsi, but what are the big things that you want listeners to take away from this conversation, both with the historical tributaries and kind of that intermingling and the similarities and differences of the Jewish Kabbalistic system and the Christian Kabbalistic system, but also just in general about these various influences on esoteric and theological thought?
An important takeaway is that esotericism is intergenerationally renegotiated. Every successive generation is locked in apology and polemic, in justifying themselves and in arguing against what they are not. And each successive generation reconceptualizes the esotericism of their world in different ways. So a lot of what guys like Pico and Ficino were trying to do was find these archetypal, pure Platonic forms of belief systems that will unlock the way to heaven or what have you, bring about perfect nature. These were processes. They weren't just like lights shined in the mind of God at one point and that became perfect. They have historical trajectories, and they need to be understood within the context of historicism. And I think that that's an important thing for me to say, is that like most people who are, I don't know what you would call them, believers or whatever, in whichever respective tradition one might believe in, they don't like to think that their system was influenced or touched by outsiders. And I think what this kind of research does is it shows you that everything we know about esotericism essentially was like a froth that rose up out of this great churning of apologetics and polemics, which were themselves apocalyptically geared. They were driven by apocalyptic expectation, to convert your neighbor, to bring about the eschaton, and to bring about world peace. And the only way to do that is to settle all of the philosophical disputes, all of the theological disputes. And these were processes, they were not events.
Focusing on the processes, on the intermingled roots. Dan, too, I know this is obviously a huge part of your research, but I know the listeners are always interested, and I always love asking, in addition to this research, is there anything that you are working on that you can give us some hints about, or any other videos, topics, issues that you're thinking about? I know there's a menagerie, but anything that kind of ties into these broader themes, or any projects down the road that you might be working on?
So right now I'm in two major projects. I'm kind of knee deep in this stuff. The first, obviously, is my dissertation, and we're basically covering everything we talked about today. These are things that I discussed in my dissertation. It's just that, the dissertation is far more detailed. It's got all the footnotes and the apparatus, and so everything will just be laid out with extensive quotations and all the appropriate citations. So there's that. That's been an ongoing thing for the last 3 years, and I've got about another year left of that. And tangential to this, I'm working on this translation of Ficino, of the De Christiana Religione, which is, it's a 300-page book. And you read like the first 20-something chapters, and they're each like a page. It's easy to do a page of Latin in a day or whatever. But then once you get up into the 25, 26, 27-ish area, the chapters just explode in size. And these are the chapters that are focused on anti-Jewish polemic. And the title headings are like arguments for the Messiah from Jews against Jews. And so we really get this idea of we're using the Jews' weapons against them. And that was a facet of Ficino that I did not know anything about when I started all of this Renaissance business. And I think that probably the reason for that is that most Ficino scholars in World War II at the Warburg Institute were Jewish. And they probably, they lived through the Weimar Republic. They lived through Nazi Germany, and they're probably sick of hearing about this stuff. To them, it wasn't original. It was all just repetitive. And so, yes, Ficino had this anti-Jewish polemical work that was quite an important part of his bibliography, but we're going to focus on his anti-Averroan Platonic theology, or we will focus on his magical magus side in the 3 books on life, or we focus on his translations of Plato and the Corpus Hermeticum, which is usually, most people, when they think of Ficino, they think, that wizard that translated Plato. Well, the wizard was a Catholic priest, and had all of these very firmly ingrained ideas about why he was resurrecting the Corpus Hermeticum, why he was looking at these things, because he could perceive in them precursors for the Trinity. So he's saying, if the ancient Egyptians have these Trinitarian prefigurations, if the Pythagoreans have Trinitarian prefigurations in their Tetractus, if the Jews have it in the Tetragrammaton, then there must be some sort of pure Platonic archetypal belief system that's out there that we can reconstruct. And so that's what I'm looking at. I'm really digging into Ficino, and I'm trying to locate to what extent the anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, and anti-pagan polemical traditions feed and fuel and give us information about Western esotericism.
So can you share this interesting fact about Petrus Alfonsi and how Alfonsi talks about the 7 liberal arts? And he says that there's kind of 2 issues or 2 subjects that are dueling for the position of the 7th crowning art. I guess, can you just lay out, what are the 7 liberal arts, and what did Alfonsi have to say about this?
Right. So he's talking about the 7 liberal arts. And so this is in the 12th century. These haven't really been systematized So you might see some discrepancies between this list and other lists you may have seen that comprise the trivium and the quadrivium. But Petrus Alfonsi basically maintains that there are 7 liberal arts. There is dialectic, which for him represents the whole trivium. So grammar, logic, and rhetoric are all squeezed into dialectic in his mind. And then the second liberal art is arithmetic. The third is geometry. The fourth is medicine, Physica. The fifth is music. And then the sixth is astronomy. But then the seventh art, he says this: the philosophers who are adept at prophecies say that the seventh art is nigromancia. Some of those who do not say it is philosophy. And those who do not study philosophy say that it is grammar. So this would be sophists, for example. So notice this opposition between philosophers and sophists. But then again, there is the third kind of philosopher who is the astral magician, the one who builds talismans and invokes spirits and does operations in line with works like Pico, or books that are harangued against in the Speculum Astronomiae, like the Liber Prestigiorum / De Imaginibus. And so Petrus Alfonsi is basically demonstrating that it's not so clear what the perfection of man entails. When you have learned all there is to learn in your day and age, all of the books that are available, which, that was possible at some point in time before printing. You really could, not read every book in the world, but you could read most books that were available in your language. And so we have these competing notions of what the perfection of man is. Does the perfection of man culminate in the practice of magic? Or does the perfection of man culminate in contemplation, as the philosopher does? Or is it just, is all of that bunk and is really just a witty tongue and good rhetoric the summit of mankind? And so these are interesting subdivisions that we will see carry on throughout the history of Western esotericism in regards to what constitutes the perfection of man's nature.
Wow, that is fascinating. Has as you said, Dan, on the outset, there might be different lists in terms of this subject, especially with the liberal arts. In history, have there been dueling arts for like a crowning art, or is this something where Petrus Alfonsi's commentary and kind of writings on this, is it kind of unique, or I guess, can you just, like, what's the broader historical context on this?
Okay, well, I mean, what binds everything together, obviously, is just this number 7. And it's trying to fit everything into this sevenfold categorization scheme that is common to Muslims, that is common to Jews, and that is common to Christians. In the Bible, whenever you see the number 7, what it really means is completion, fullness. 7 days of creation, 7 planets, these kinds of things, 7 days of the week. And so 7 represents the fullness. And presumably at different times and at different places, they divided all of the things that there were to know into 7 divisions, and the divisions don't necessarily all line up with one another. So, for example, in Petrus Alfonsi, dialectic stands for logic and rhetoric together, whereas that used to be the first 3 part, or not used to be, but rather in another systematization of it, grammar, logic, and rhetoric are the first 3 parts. And then, for example, his 4th liberal art is medicine, and he's a physician, so of course he's going to say medicine is important, but medicine is not necessarily a liberal art in most reckonings. Usually it's something along the lines of arithmetic, astronomy, music, and geometry in varying orders. Medicine is kind of an extra university. It's like alchemy in the sense that it happened often on the fringes of universities and things like that. But the university system was not all that developed by Petrus Alfonsi's time anyways. We're in the century where universities are just starting, and there are very few of them. They're mostly in Italy and, at Paris and Oxford. So yeah, these what's interesting, I think, to me at least, is my fascination is seeing how Petrus Alfonsi's influence ripples on in debates between Christians and Jews over esoteric matters. And one of the interesting ideas is that in nigromancia, in the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetic tradition, you have this idea of perfect nature. And perfect nature is the adept working in alignment with the planets that rule in his birth chart. So it's really, not fighting against your nature and going with the nature that you were born with. And then through the 7 liberal arts, bringing that into some kind of fulfillment. And that generates a kind of genius or daimon that exists inside of you, but is also an entity that is outside of you. So you get works like The Daimon of Socrates by Apuleius, and these demonstrate how Socrates had this spirit or this logos that was outside of him and that he was in communion with, and that was his higher nature or his perfect nature. And that we can all sort of cultivate that inner dialogue with our higher being, with our higher nature, with our holy guardian angel, if you will. That's not the language they used, but these concepts are connected. That he believed that level of perfection was expressed in the ability to do magic. And in Kabbalah, you have a notion called the tselem, which is the astral body. And so it says God made man in his own image. And now this image that God makes man in is the tselem, or the astral body. And Jewish thinkers who were very interested as physicians, as astronomers, as scientists of the day, who were reading works like the Hayat al-Hakim, which had been translated into Hebrew, they were debating on where does this perfect nature, this spirit of the wise man, where does that exist in the great chain of being? How high is it? Is it really the highest thing that you can achieve? Are there greater levels of beatitude? Like is really like being in contact with a spirit and being able to do magic really all there is in this world? And so this culminates in the debates over the mors osculi, the death of the kiss. And this is kind of what I want to talk about. And this is this idea that was drawn from Song of Songs 1 verse 2, chapter 1 verse 2. And it says, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for thy love is better than wine." And now, nobody was fixated on the literal level of scripture, as we talked about earlier. People read scripture in these multivalent ways. They tried to come at things multidimensionally. And now that's something that both Christians and Jews try to do. And the Rambam, or Maimonides, who was a Andalusian philosopher, Jewish philosopher who lived in Egypt, rationalist philosopher, he introduced the idea of the death of the kiss, or the mors osculi, as a mingling of breaths. So the idea is that kissing is not like, what we do today where we just smoosh each other's face or whatever. They would lock lips and they would exchange the air in each other's lungs. And so the idea was what is being described in the Song of Songs is, at the spiritual level, the spirit of the adept or of the contemplator or what have you, exiting the body and becoming mingled with the breath or the ruach of God, and that becoming indistinguishable, right? The spirit of man and the spirit of God, they blend into one, and then the distinction between man and God is blurred. And what Maimonides and what Rashi and these rabbis were saying was that essentially God absorbed the prophets. When God takes up Aaron, or when Moses dies, or when Elijah gets taken up, or Enoch, for example, they're being translated. They're being moved into a new state. They are becoming like Metatrons, which means beside the throne. They are recognizing their angelic nature and becoming one in the courtroom of the King of all the spirits. And now this idea sat kind of tenuously with Christians, because this idea of the soul leaving the body and becoming eliminated, it basically conflicted with the idea that the soul was eternal, because eternal runs in both directions. It is eternal in the past and it is eternal in the future. If it gets absorbed and dissolved into God, then how is the soul eternal? So this is where ideas about perfect nature start to come into competition with these more Kabbalistic notions of leaving the body. And so what Pico and Ficino refer to these states as is felicity, felicitas, which I translate as peace. You could translate it as blessedness, but the sense is like this cosmic peace and oneness at the center of the multiverse. You dissolve into a perfect beatific state, but you retain your individuality because you are co-eternal with God. So what Pico and Ficino, who are both readers of Picatrix, but also very skeptical about the power of astrology and the power of magic and its limits, they said, look, there are two kinds of felicity. And they got this idea from Yohanan Alamano, who was blending Kabbalism and these pseudo-Aristotelian Picatrix-like currents. And they said, look, there are two felicities. There's a lesser and a greater. The lesser felicity happens in the body, and that is the perfect nature. That is achieving the Salem. That is like learning everything there is to know and becoming perfected in the knowledge of the world. But the problem is that all that can do is show you that the world is empedoclean. It is made up of strife. It is just battle, like nature is red in tooth and claw, and it is nothing more than opposites duking it out. And that is what nature ultimately is. And we need to ascend up the great chain of being out of our bodies through Christ, obviously. That's the main thing, is through the humanity of Christ, we ascend to divinity. And we basically shed our bodies where the seven liberal arts no longer are of any use, because they've taught us what we need to know, which is that nature is wrought on strife and conflict. And we are led back up through that angelic hierarchy to the oneness, through the ever more rarefied states. And it's the caritas, the love, which propels like an attractive force the individual towards the throne, or towards the center, toward the light. And there you can settle in the rungs of the angelic hierarchy. And there are the seraphim, who are in the immediate ring around the throne, and they burn with the love of God, with caritas. And so they're like on fire constantly. And these are people like St. Francis or the martyrs. These are people who wore themselves out through their charity, through their renunciation, and through their apostolic life, and took up sackcloth and basically, got leprosy from kissing the sores of lepers. They annihilated their bodies to pierce through with that caritas into the seraphic world. And so when you see pictures of St. Francis, you always see him pierced through with his stigmata, but there are strings that come out of the seraphim, which usually has like a face of Christ, and they are shooting beams or strings that are piercing through Francis. So there's this idea that he's like a puppet or something, or some sort of multi-dimensional being that is operating on different planes of existence at the same time. So it's like the 4 levels of scriptural interpretation that you would apply to a text, but this is applied to real life. And so you have this scaffolding over top of your physical body that transcends in different realms. And he's trying to get back to that highest realm. And the idea is that the 7 liberal arts will bring you to that knowledge, but you have to embody the sacred theology, if you will, the Prisca Theologia, or the Philosophia Universalis. And that is what will bring you next to the throne and make you like the angels. So you don't want to be like the seraphim necessarily because they burn with the love of God. But if you are a contemplator, like a 12th century Benedictine or Cistercian monk, or a person like Pico, who's not necessarily out kissing lepers and doing penitential deeds with the poor, he's more so trying to approach God through contemplation. And so that's the cherubic rung in the throne room. And by being like the cherubim in their contemplation of God, you basically ascend to the cherubic state. But always the soul of the individual is maintained so that in that higher realm, it's not just, a soul pool where everything is, there's no distinction. It's actually like a throne room that has all of the souls in their perfected forms, coexisting together in like a giant court of a cosmic king. Where this ties into the Renaissance too, you get is ideas like Plato's Symposium. So Plato's Symposium has Diotima's Ladder, and Ficino was the translator of the Symposium, and Pico wrote a commentary on it. And they were very interested in this idea of Diotima's Ladder of love, and how you move from more gross carnal states of love towards more rarefied and subtle states of love itself. So you move from the love of a body to the love of multiple bodies to the love of love itself. And that is sort of what allows you to pierce through into the throne room and achieve the higher felicity, which was essentially born out of a foil to perfect nature. It's like the Christian theologians are like, what in our cosmology is better than perfection? And they're saying peace.
What a beautifully poignant and multi-dimensional image and contemplative valence to navigate through. Shedding, let's see, what was I writing down here? This is just amazing. Shedding the archons of the 7 liberal arts, settling in the rungs, the celestial rungs, achieving that felicity. Dan, this is, I guess my last question would be, given this amazing and powerful imagery and this kind of powerful way to approach the liberal arts and their kind of purpose to this kind of higher divinity, so to speak, how should people, given this powerful imagery, Dan, kind of approach the liberal arts like that? Or if they're studying their own liberal arts, especially someone who's so well versed as yourself, is this, do you find this also a very useful thing as well as a deeply contemplative thing from a mystical perspective, I guess.
Well, we need to remember that the liberal arts, the sense of why they are liberal, is that they liberate. They turn you from a landless peasant into a literate, educated, free man who can work for, who can be a lawyer, who can be a doctor, who can be whatever they want to be. And that's the point, is that you are now thoroughly educated. You're not just like a little cog in a wheel. You have a full knowledge of the world, and now you're free to make your decisions. What these guys did was they just extended that freedom. There are enormous precedents for this linking of freedom and the spirit. So a quote from Hegel is that the essence of matter is gravity, and the essence of spirit is freedom. And God also is a spirit. One of his threefold aspects is a spiritual aspect, and he is infinite, unbounded, unlimited. What do these words mean? They mean unimpinged. They mean free. And so to become like God, if God is all good, he wants all other things to be good, which means he wants things to be like him. And to be like God is to be free. And I don't mean free in the sense of, do whatever you want. I mean, do what is inside of you. Facere quod est in se is how they would formulate this idea. And that you are free when you are aligned with your true will, as the Thelemite would say. The thing is that the true will here was set forth by Christ. Christ is this archetypal form who creates the pattern or the exemplar for the true Platonic man, who then ascends to his status of freedom. It's not just free from governmental pressures, it's also free from desire. And it's also freedom from freedom itself, in a way. So what the liberal arts do is they are a staircase to freedom, and these Renaissance men just tried to extend that into their theology as well. And they privileged the theology, the Neoplatonic Christian theology of Dionysius the Areopagite, and they stacked it on top of the celestial hierarchy. And you can see this right away in Agrippa, right? The 3 books of occult philosophy, they are organized in this hierarchical manner. And that's based on a pattern that was set down by Pico's Heptapolis before him. And you can see it repeated numerous times where you have, we have the terrestrial world at the bottom, and then we have the celestial vault over top of it, and that's populated with celestial intelligences, as the Timaeus tells us. And then on top of that, we have the angelic hierarchy. We pierce through this dimensional veil, and we get into this other world that is beyond the stars. And that, I think, is just an extension of their quest for freedom. So they wanted to be free, 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 free. And then the telos of their freedom was peace. It wasn't magic, which is why Petrus Alfonsi is saying, look, some people hold the height of the 7 liberal arts to be magic. Others hold it to be pure contemplation. And then others hold it to be silly, all just illusions. It's just word games.
Remembering the true importance of the rungs of the 7 liberal arts. So many amazing points. A lot of things to meditate on, listeners. I really hope that you enjoy that as much as I did. Intellectual historian, classicist, philosopher, psychonaut, musician, hermetic delver, the modern hermeticist, Mr. Dan Attrell. Dan, thank you so much